That morning, a fisherman hauled a relic from the cold Alaskan depths. And in that moment, an 18-year-old mystery was not solved, but brutally reopened. The story of Robert "Robbie" Stevens was, until that discovery, a familiar ghost story of the Alaskan wilderness. A bright young man, drawn by the siren call of untamed nature, who vanished without a trace into the terrifying silence. But the kayak, a faded yellow shell dragged onto the deck of a trawler near Prince William Sound, did not whisper of a simple accident. It screamed of something far more complex, a darker narrative that had been expertly concealed by the ocean's vast, indifferent shroud. Robbie Stevens was 24, an aerospace engineering student from Seattle, whose restless intellect found its only solace in the monumental solitude of Alaska. His was a spirit that craved the edge of the map. He arrived in Valdez in the summer of 2005, a small, bustling port town clinging to the northern edge of Prince William Sound, and immediately purchased the infamous yellow kayak. He told his parents, over a crackling satellite phone call, that he intended to paddle the entire sound, a journey of hundreds of miles through a labyrinth of fjords, glaciers, and unpredictable currents. His mother remembered his voice, confident, even a little defiant, a young man testing the limits of his own mortality. It was the last time she would ever hear it. 3 days after Robbie set off, the first cold stab of dread struck his family. He had promised daily check-ins via his satellite phone, a promise he had always meticulously kept. When the first day passed without a call, anxiety began its slow, inevitable climb. By the second, anxiety had curdled into palpable fear. The family, immobilized thousands of miles away, called the Valdez police, a small force accustomed to tourists losing their way, but rarely their lives, in the deceptively placid waters. The initial assumption, as it always is in these cases, was elemental. A rogue wave, hypothermia, a capsized vessel swallowed by the Sound's frigid depths. The vastness of the search area, a sprawling maze of inlets and open ocean, was a daunting, almost demoralizing reality for the small search and rescue teams. Aerial shot of Prince William Sound, vast blue water, snow-capped mountains ringing the horizon, an overwhelming sense of scale. Helicopters flew grids over the main channels. The Coast Guard ran patterns for days. They found nothing. Not a paddle, not a life vest, not a scrap of brightly colored fabric. It was as if Robbie and the distinctive yellow vessel had simply dissolved into the air. The search was officially called off after 10 agonizing days, concluding with the inevitable and devastating classification: presumed drowned. The Stevens family returned to Seattle, their grief a silent, permanent companion, the lack of a body leaving an open, festering wound that time could not truly close. For 18 years, the mystery was categorized not as a crime, but as a tragedy of nature, an unfortunate footnote in the countless sagas of the Alaskan wild. The case was cold, closed, and filed away beneath the weight of years and ice. Then came the spring of 2023. A commercial fishing vessel miles from where Robbie was last reported snagged something heavy in its nets. It was the yellow kayak. The water, the Earth's oldest and most efficient preserver, had returned it, but not intact. It was heavily scarred, the fiberglass dulled and scratched, bearing the undeniable signature of years spent in the deep. What drew the attention of the deckhands immediately was not its faded color, but a single, undeniable piece of damage. The kayak's bow was not simply weathered, it was stoved in, a ragged, catastrophic puncture that forensic experts would later analyze with chilling precision. Furthermore, the small, waterproof storage compartment, designed to be impervious to the sea, had been violently pried open, its hatch cover missing entirely. This was not the damage of a kayak simply caught in the tide or dashed against rocks. This was the damage of an impact and a subsequent, frantic act of vandalism or theft. The vessel's interior, though largely waterlogged, still held traces of what a trained eye would recognize as forensic gold. A single small hand-painted ceramic pendant, one that Robbie's sister had given him before he left, was miraculously found wedged deep beneath the seat. The chain was broken. It was a fragment of certainty in a sea of speculation, and with it, the case moved in one agonizing, shocking moment from an open water accident to a criminal investigation. The somber silence of the cold case file was shattered by the raw, kinetic energy of new, undeniable evidence. The initial assumptions were not only wrong, they were a cruel misdirection. The wilderness had not taken Robbie Stevens. Someone or something had intervened, and the long-lost kayak was now a silent, damning witness returned from the abyss. The battered yellow hull, now resting on a cold metal slab in an Anchorage forensics lab, spoke a language of violence and deceit that 18 years of silence had failed to erase. The investigators, a new generation of detectives looking at an old tragedy with fresh eyes, approached the vessel with the gravity reserved for a tomb. The single ragged hole in the bow was the core of the puzzle, and the initial analysis immediately eliminated the prevailing theory of an accidental drowning. The damage was inconsistent with a glancing blow from a small vessel or a capsize against a natural formation. Instead, the shape of the puncture, a clean, almost surgical strike, suggested a direct, sustained impact from an object moving at a relatively high velocity. The evidence was circumstantial but profound, a propeller strike. But even this chilling realization was only the beginning of the darkness. The forensic team's deep dive into the composite material surrounding the puncture revealed a faint, nearly microscopic residue, metallic in nature, that did not belong to the kayak's original construction. It was an environmental contaminant, a fleeting signature of the object that had collided with Robbie's vessel, and its analysis would require a level of detail that could only be achieved by the most advanced laboratories. The second, and perhaps more disturbing, piece of physical evidence was the storage compartment. Close-up photo of the kayak's damaged storage hatch. It was a standard high-quality marine-grade compartment designed to be airtight and secured by a robust, multi-point latch system. It was not merely open, the plastic had been warped and cracked around the edges, suggesting not a simple unlocking, but a forced, violent entry using a tool, possibly a crowbar or a large knife. Why would an accidental sinking, or even a hit and run by a pleasure craft, involve a deliberate attempt to breach the waterproof storage? The answer was immediate and chilling. Someone had been looking for something. The presumption of the drowning had collapsed entirely. This was no longer a rescue mission. It was a homicide investigation, cold and ancient, dragged into the blinding light of the present. The investigators' focus shifted immediately from the search for a body to the search for a motive. What could a 24-year-old engineering student traveling light in a single kayak possibly possess that would incite such violence? His backpack, which was believed to contain a laptop, a camera, and a few personal effects, had never been recovered. The official report from 2005 had noted his possessions: standard camping gear, a detailed map, and the satellite phone. But a casual mention in the original police file, a single paragraph overlooked for nearly 2 decades, suddenly took on terrifying significance. Robbie Stevens was known to his university colleagues as an amateur geologist and a tireless researcher. Before his trip, he had been corresponding with a number of private mining firms, expressing a profound interest in the geological anomalies of the Prince William Sound region, specifically the potential for rare earth mineral deposits deep within the coastal fjords. The correspondence detailed his plan to take several small, unmarked soil samples, not for commercial profit, but for an independent thesis project. This detail, innocuous at the time, now reframed the entire narrative. The theft was not of cash or jewelry. It was likely the theft of information, a secret contained in his notes, his camera, or the laptop he carried. The vast, empty silence of the Sound suddenly acquired a new, darker dimension, one of hidden wealth, industrial espionage, and ruthless corporate greed. The team, now operating under the pressure of a ticking clock, even though the crime was 18 years old, initiated a massive, complex background investigation into every commercial vessel operating in the vicinity of Robbie's last known coordinates during that fateful week in 2005. This was a monumental task involving the laborious sifting of archived Coast Guard logs and commercial shipping manifests. The challenge was compounded by the fact that many of the smaller private craft, the very vessels most likely to be involved in a clandestine off-the-books operation, would have left no official record. The investigators utilized the few data points they had: the time frame, the approximate location of the recovery, and the geological research notes. They began cross-referencing known and suspected independent prospectors and smaller, less scrupulous mining operations that had active interest in the region during the mid-2000s. The quiet, conversational tone of the investigation had shifted. It was no longer a mournful reconstruction of a disappearance. It was a focused hunt for a killer, motivated by a secret that could be worth millions. The silence of the Sound had protected the culprit for nearly 2 decades, but the return of the yellow kayak had marked the end of that protection. The gravity of the situation was immense, and the emotional weight on the Stevens family, now experiencing a profound re-traumatization, was almost unbearable. They had found the kayak, but they were still desperately searching for their son, and the agonizing new realization was that he hadn't merely been lost. He had been executed for a secret he may not have even realized he possessed. The preliminary analysis of the metallic residue found embedded near the catastrophic bow puncture sent the investigation in a definitive and shocking direction. The particles, once isolated and subjected to mass spectrometry, were not simple boat paint or engine grease. They constituted a highly specific alloy of marine-grade brass, aluminum, and a distinctive trace element used primarily in the manufacturing of commercial fishing trawler propellers during a narrow window in the early 2000s. This was the chemical fingerprint of the murder weapon, a massive, powerful blade turning in the frigid water. The forensic evidence was now a silent prosecutor, directly indicting a vessel with a specific profile, a large, heavy-duty commercial boat. The accidental drowning theory had been utterly destroyed. The picture emerging was one of a deliberate, calculated action, the crushing, fatal blow of a high-powered trawler propeller driven intentionally into the path of a small, fragile kayak. This was not a tragic oversight in the vastness of the ocean. This was an act of cold-blooded aggression, followed by a meticulous effort to cover the crime. The new focus allowed the investigative team to drastically narrow the scope of their search through the 18-year-old shipping manifests. They began to filter the old records for large commercial fishing or prospecting vessels that were active in the precise quadrant of Prince William Sound during the week of Robbie's disappearance, paying particular attention to those with a history of operating outside regulated fishing zones or those with owners known for aggressive territorial disputes. A list of 37 vessels was initially flagged, a manageable number, but the key to unlocking the true narrative was still hidden within the layers of historical data and the murky motivations of the people involved. The sheer cruelty of the act, the destruction of the kayak to silence its sole occupant, spoke of an absolute need for secrecy, an overwhelming fear that whatever Robbie Stevens knew or carried could not be allowed to surface. The missing storage hatch, the prying marks around it, and the total lack of the satellite phone, laptop, or camera led the detectives to reconstruct the final moments of the event. Storyboard image. A small yellow kayak is struck by the massive churning propeller of a trawler. A figure in a large boat then leans over to search the sinking vessel. Robbie would have been disabled by the initial impact, his kayak rapidly taking on water. The perpetrator or perpetrators must have then moved in quickly, not to render aid, but to salvage the secret they sought. They wouldn't have risked bringing the compromised kayak on board. They would have sunk it, weighting it down to ensure it would never resurface. The absence of Robbie's body was a terrifying testament to their diligence. The man who had ended a young life for a secret had been thorough, and the Sound, with its abyssal depths, had been a perfect accomplice. During a meticulous review of the archived 2005 police interviews, one name kept reappearing, mentioned almost in passing by local fishermen, a man named Silas Thorne. Thorne was the owner and captain of a mid-sized trawler called the Sea Serpent. He was a known local figure, notorious for his aggressive expansion into unpatrolled fishing areas, and a man with a reputation for intense, almost paranoid, secrecy regarding his business dealings. At the time of the original investigation, Thorne had provided a brief, unverified alibi, claiming he was fishing far to the west of the search area. The original detective, distracted by the overwhelming size of the search grid and the consensus of accidental drowning, had accepted the statement at face value. Now Thorne's proximity to the area, combined with the new forensic profile of the killer vessel, made his name leap off the page. Furthermore, a deeper dive into his financials revealed a critical piece of information. In the months leading up to Robbie's disappearance, Thorne had been aggressively petitioning the state for a mineral rights lease in one of the remote fjords that Robbie Stevens had explicitly marked on his own geological map. The coincidence was statistically impossible. The quiet academic pursuit of rare earth minerals by a young student had intersected lethally with the cutthroat, clandestine operations of a man determined to secure a fortune. The investigators knew they had their prime suspect, a man whose motive was now crystal clear. The fear that an idealistic student would uncover and publicize the exact coordinates of a geological prize Thorne intended to claim for himself. The next crucial step was to find the sea serpent and, more importantly, to analyze its propeller. The challenge, however, was that Silas Thorne was a phantom, his trawler's movements almost impossible to track in the years since the crime. The case had transitioned from a cold file to an active, high-stakes hunt for a man who had successfully evaded justice for nearly 2 decades, a man who believed the ocean had buried his secret forever. The focus of the investigation now turned entirely to Silas Thorne and the sea serpent. 18 years is a long time for a boat to hide, and an even longer time for a person to shed their past. The original 2005 documents, digitized and analyzed through modern algorithms, revealed a patchwork of evasiveness in Thorne's initial testimony. His alibi, which the original investigators had failed to corroborate, relied entirely on the statement of a single, unreliable deckhand who had since vanished. The new team, utilizing state-of-the-art satellite tracking data, retroactively cross-referenced with archived maritime transponder logs, began to meticulously reconstruct the sea serpent's movements from the summer of 2005. The technology that did not exist then was now slowly, methodically, peeling back the layers of Thorne's carefully constructed lie. The digital reconstruction revealed a profound discrepancy. While Thorne claimed his vessel was operating hundreds of miles to the west, the intermittent pings from the sea serpent's transponder, pings he likely assumed were too infrequent to matter, placed the vessel directly within a 50-mile radius of Robbie Stevens' last confirmed location. Moreover, the vessel's track showed a sudden, unexplained deviation from its assumed fishing route on the morning of Robbie's disappearance, followed by a period of several hours where the transponder signal was entirely offline. In the cold, vast theater of Prince William Sound, this gap was a deafening admission of guilt. It suggested a deliberate shutdown, a common tactic used by poachers or those engaged in illicit activities, followed by a rapid movement to a known choke point in the kayaking route. Animated map graphic. The red line of the sea serpent's track suddenly veers off course, stops, and a yellow dot representing the kayak disappears near the point of deviation. The next critical challenge was locating the sea serpent in 2023. Thorne, a man whose life was his boat, had been careful. The vessel was not registered under his name, but under a complex, rotating series of shell corporations. The investigators utilized a specialist in financial forensics, who painstakingly unwound the thread of ownership, a labyrinthine path that led from Anchorage to a numbered company in the Cayman Islands, and finally back to a dilapidated dry dock in a remote, forgotten corner of coastal Oregon. Silas Thorne, it was discovered, had been living an almost ascetic life, maintaining a low profile, rarely leaving the anonymity of the dry dock, but keeping the sea serpent perpetually operational. The assumption was that he was waiting for the perfect opportunity to slip back into the clandestine rare earth mining operation he had secured by silencing a young man 18 years prior. A covert surveillance operation was immediately launched. The investigators needed more than just circumstantial evidence and a suspicious boat track. They needed a link to the physical damage on the kayak. The key was the sea serpent's propeller. When the vessel was subtly photographed during a refueling operation, the images were sent to the forensic team. Their analysis was devastatingly conclusive. The propeller, a massive custom-machined bronze piece, bore a distinct, asymmetrical scar on one of its 4 blades. A microsample acquired later under a search warrant for routine environmental inspection confirmed the truth. Inside the groove of the scar, microscopic traces of faded yellow fiberglass and a chemical compound matching the kayak's unique resin were found. The vessel had been cleaned meticulously over the years, but the deep gouge in the metal had provided a protected crevice, a time capsule for the definitive piece of evidence. The sea serpent's propeller was the murder weapon, and the trawler was a floating confession. The net began to close. The investigators then focused on the possibility of a body. Thorne, a man who had sunk a kayak, would not have simply left a corpse to float. They theorized that the body of Robbie Stevens, along with the technological evidence of his geological research, would have been taken on board and disposed of with the same ruthless efficiency that characterized the initial attack. The depth of the sound, the severity of the tides, and the difficulty of a search made finding a body near impossible. However, one of Thorne's former crew members, a desperate man whose silence had been bought for years, finally cracked under the pressure of the renewed, high-profile investigation. He described the terrifying aftermath of the incident, confirming that Thorne, in a cold rage, had used his own boat to tow Robbie's body far out to sea, weighting it with engine parts, ensuring the currents would take it into the deepest, most inaccessible trenches of the Pacific. The emotional arc was now complete. From a boy's youthful optimism to the horrific certainty of his cold, calculated demise, the focus shifted to the apprehension of Silas Thorne, a man who was about to learn that the sea, which had served as his silent vault, was now ready to give up its secrets. The arrest of Silas Thorne was executed in the early hours of a cold, misty morning at the Oregon dry dock. There was no struggle, only a chilling, almost indifferent resignation in his eyes. He was a man who had lived with the constant, crushing knowledge of his crime for 18 years, and the arrival of the authorities seemed less like a confrontation and more like a long-delayed release. He was silent during his initial processing, offering no confession, but the case against him was no longer reliant on a single word. It was an edifice built on the unshakable foundation of forensic science and the digital trail he thought he had erased. The evidence was presented as a chilling linear narrative. The rare earth mineral motive, the contradictory transponder data, the testimony of the former deckhand, and the undeniable chemical signature of the yellow kayak embedded in the sea serpent's propeller. Close-up image of the scarred bronze propeller blade. With Thorne in custody, the investigative team shifted their attention to finding the one piece of evidence that could truly bring closure to the Stevens family and reveal the full scope of Thorne's operation: the geological data. They were convinced that Thorne had successfully retrieved Robbie's laptop and notes from the sinking kayak. Why else go to such extraordinary lengths to destroy the vessel's storage compartment? A detailed search of the sea serpent revealed nothing immediately obvious, as Thorne had been careful to keep his operational materials off his personal vessel. But a deep dive into his financial records and property holdings led the team to a small remote cabin he owned in the Alaskan interior, a hidden retreat he used for solitary planning and storage. The search of the cabin was an archaeological excavation of a killer's life. Tucked away beneath a loose floorboard in a mildewed metal box, they found what they were looking for. It was a collection of documents, a set of annotated charts detailing the mineral composition of a specific fjord, and a battered, water-damaged laptop, though the computer was nearly ruined by the years of exposure. A team of digital forensic specialists managed to recover the hard drive. The data extracted was the final, irrefutable proof of Thorne's motive. It contained Robbie Stevens' final detailed geological report, a thesis draft that precisely mapped a massive, high-grade deposit of rare earth elements, a deposit that was, at the time, completely unknown to the public and potentially worth hundreds of millions of dollars. The coordinates in the analysis were a scientific treasure, and they were dated only hours before Robbie's disappearance. The young man on his intellectual adventure had stumbled upon a fortune. Screenshot of Robbie's geological map with a specific marked coordinate. The documents also contained a chilling final detail. An unsent email, drafted by Robbie just before he left the last inhabited port, was addressed to his professor. It stated his excitement about the samples he had gathered and mentioned a strange, large trawler he had seen shadowing him on his way out of the main channel, noting that the vessel had inexplicably shut off its transponder. He had been so close to sending the warning, but in the end that small, almost casual observation became his unintended posthumous testament. The trial was a media sensation. The story of the young student, the vast, silent wilderness, and the ruthless greed of a man who would kill for a secret that lay hidden in the earth, captured the public imagination. The prosecution, led by a determined team, presented the recovered kayak, the scarred propeller, and the laptop data as an unbroken chain of forensic truth. Silas Thorne was convicted on all counts. His appeal, based on the age of the crime and the lack of a body, was dismissed. The sheer weight of the scientific evidence was insurmountable. Thorne was sentenced to life imprisonment, the cold, silent walls of the prison serving as a final ironic echo of the Alaskan wilderness he had used to hide his crime. The ultimate closure for the Stevens family was not the recovery of a body, a search they knew would be impossible, but the cold, hard certainty of justice. They had endured 18 years of agonizing uncertainty, a psychological torment built on the belief that the ocean had merely claimed their son. The return of the yellow kayak had not been a simple discovery. It was a devastating revelation, a final dramatic statement from the deep that Robbie Stevens had not been lost to nature, but deliberately and violently erased by a man who valued a secret more than a human life. The story of Robbie Stevens now stands as a somber monument to the fact that in the unforgiving quest for fortune, the most terrifying danger does not come from the elements, but from the darkness that lurks in the human heart. The legal and emotional fallout from the conviction of Silas Thorne extended far beyond the courtroom, rippling through the close-knit, often secretive world of Alaskan commercial fishing and mining speculation. The revelation of the rare earth mineral deposit, detailed with such precision in Robbie Stevens' recovered laptop, immediately triggered a massive, complex, legal battle over the mineral rights. The government, using the data that Robbie had so diligently collected, was able to confirm the immense value of the deposit. The irony was devastating. The secret that Thorne had murdered to keep was now a public spectacle, the ultimate, ruinous price of his greed. The land that Robbie Stevens had explored out of intellectual curiosity was now the subject of billion-dollar corporate litigation, and the young student's final work had inadvertently rewritten the economic map of a remote Alaskan region. The conviction also prompted a deep, painful re-examination of the initial 2005 investigation. The errors were clear, a damning testament to the danger of quick assumptions in complex missing person cases. The original detectives, overwhelmed by the vastness of the search area and the powerful prevailing narrative of Alaskan tragedy, had failed to follow up on the simple, verifiable facts. Thorne's suspicious alibi, his interest in the mineral lease, and the crucial fact that Robbie's disappearance was not the only odd event reported in the region that week. The closure of the case had been premature, driven by convenience rather than conclusive evidence. The Stevens family, through their profound grief, found a new mission. They lobbied fiercely for a national standard that would mandate advanced forensic analysis in cold cases involving vessels, ensuring that technology from the future could always have a chance to interrogate the silent evidence of the past. Archival photo of the 2005 search operation. Helicopters against a massive snow-covered fjord. An image of overwhelming, unhelpful scale. The physical evidence of the case, the scarred yellow kayak, and the massive bronze propeller were carefully preserved, not as morbid trophies, but as tangible instruments of a narrative of injustice and ultimate accountability. The kayak, in particular, became an almost mythic object, a symbol of the ocean's refusal to keep a secret. It had traveled an epic, silent journey in the deep, only to be returned by a fortuitous accident of the currents, a mute, battered witness to a heinous crime. Its return 18 years later defied statistical probability and the logic of the sea, transforming an accidental discovery into a profound act of delayed justice. The Stevens family requested that the pendant, the small ceramic token of love found wedged in the kayak's rotting hull, be returned to them. This one small personal object, the only thing not destroyed or stolen by the killer, became their final private piece of closure, a connection to the bright, adventurous life that had been so brutally extinguished. The fate of Silas Thorne, now stripped of his freedom and his fortune, served as a grim cautionary tale. He had spent nearly 2 decades as a free man, a shadow moving through society, a man haunted by the knowledge of what he had done. He had calculated the cost of the crime, the difficulty of discovery, and the indifference of the wilderness, but he had failed to calculate the tenacity of the human spirit and the relentless, non-linear nature of forensic science. His grand, murderous scheme had been undone by a microscopic trace of paint on a propeller and an old ship's log that was finally read with the correct suspicion. The narrative of Robbie Stevens, the boy who vanished, was now complete. He was not a victim of a colossal wave or a sudden storm, but a victim of an all-too-human flaw, insatiable greed. The Sound, once a symbol of wild, pure adventure, now held the indelible stain of a perfect crime that was, by the sheer audacity of its revelation, fundamentally imperfect. The story would forever stand as a chilling reminder. The wilderness may conceal, but it rarely forgives. And sometimes, the deepest secrets of the human heart are finally revealed only when the cold, dark waters decide it is time. The quiet conversation of justice, though it may take years to begin, is ultimately louder than the fiercest storm.